Lately, something about my wife, Melanie, just didn't sit right with me. It was subtle at first, little things that you might not even notice unless you were looking for them. But once I started paying attention, those little things started adding up, forming a picture that I couldn't ignore. Melanie had always been someone I could rely on. We had our routines and our shared responsibilities, and while we both led busy lives, there was a rhythm to our days that gave me comfort. But that rhythm began to falter. She started spending more time on her phone, often retreating to another room to take calls or answer messages. When I'd ask who it was, she'd dismiss it with a quick "just work" or "a friend," but her answers were always vague, and the way she avoided eye contact made my stomach churn. Then there were the late nights. Melanie was always punctual, the kind of person who valued routine and predictability. But suddenly, she started coming home late from work more often, with one excuse after another. At first, it was easy to brush off: overtime at the office, a client dinner that ran late, catching up with an old friend. But as the weeks went on, these late nights became more frequent and the excuses more far-fetched. I tried to shake off the growing unease, telling myself that I was being paranoid. But every time I looked at her, I saw something different in her eyes, a distance, a preoccupation that wasn't there before. She used to share everything with me, but now it seemed like she was always somewhere else. Mentally, even when she was sitting right next to me. It wasn't just her behavior at home that changed. I noticed how she started dressing differently, too. Melanie had always had a simple, elegant style, but lately, she began paying more attention to her appearance. New clothes, more makeup, and perfume I hadn't smelled on her before. It wasn't that I didn't like the change, it was just that it felt out of character, almost as if she was trying to impress someone, and that someone wasn't me. I could feel the distance growing between us, like a slow-moving storm cloud that I couldn't stop. I tried to reach out, to pull her back into our old routine, but every time I did, she seemed to slip further away. When I asked her about the long hours, she'd snap at me, accusing me of being controlling or insecure. And when I'd try to initiate a conversation about us, she'd shut it down, saying she was too tired or too busy. These were all signs, and deep down, I knew it. I knew something was wrong. But I wasn't ready to confront it. Instead, I let the doubts fester, growing stronger with every unanswered question and every missed opportunity to reconnect. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where she was and who she was with. The cracks in our marriage were becoming more and more visible, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, something precious that I might never be able to get back. The gnawing suspicion that something was wrong kept eating away at me. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a shadow that haunted my every waking thought. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt, and I knew that the only way to get to the bottom of it was to bring in someone who could uncover what was hiding just out of my reach. That's when I decided to hire a private detective. His name was Jack Thompson, a man with a reputation for getting results. When I first met him, I was struck by how unassuming he looked: short, balding, with a worn leather jacket that seemed to have seen better days. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, told me he was the kind of person who missed nothing. Jack had been in the business for over 20 years, and I knew he'd seen it all. I didn't need to explain much before he nodded, understanding exactly what I was asking him to do. Jack was discreet, methodical, and professional. Over several weeks, he trailed Melanie, documenting her every move, capturing the moments I could never witness myself. It was a painful process, knowing that each day brought him closer to revealing the truth. Yet I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know, even if it meant destroying the life we had built together. The day Jack called me into his office was the day my worst fears were confirmed. As I sat across from him, the air in the room felt thick and oppressive. Jack didn't waste time with small talk. He placed a thick manila envelope on the desk between us, sliding it toward me. "Everything's in there," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sympathy. "Photos, transcripts, receipts. You deserve to know what's been going on. Dot. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope, pulling out the stack of evidence Jack had meticulously gathered. The first thing I saw was a series of photographs, grainy, black and white shots of Melanie, my wife, in the arms of another man. The man was older and distinguished, with graying hair and a tailored suit that spoke of wealth and power. I recognized him immediately. Richard Calloway, a well-known businessman in the area, someone I had seen at a few charity events but had never really paid much attention to. Until now. The pictures told a story I didn't want to believe. Melanie and Richard met at a high-end restaurant, their heads bent close together as they talked, his hand resting on hers in a way that was far too intimate for mere acquaintances. Other photos showed them entering a hotel together, his arm around her waist, her face turned toward him with a smile that I hadn't seen in months. I felt sick to my stomach, bile rising in my throat as I flipped through the evidence, each image a dagger to my heart. But it wasn't just the photos. Jack had gone further, digging into Richard's background and uncovering the true nature of their relationship. Richard wasn't just another fling, he was a calculated move on Melanie's part. Jack found bank statements, wire transfers, and documents that showed Melanie had been receiving large sums of money from Richard over the past few months. It wasn't just an affair, it was a transaction. Richard had offered her a substantial amount of money, a payoff for her silence. For keeping their relationship hidden from the public eye, from me. As I continued to sift through the evidence, the reality of it all hit me like a freight train. Melanie had sold herself and had betrayed me not just emotionally but financially. She had chosen money, power, and security over the love and trust we had built together. And Richard, he had exploited that, using his wealth to manipulate her, to make her an accomplice in his twisted game. I sat there in Jack's office, numb, staring at the damning evidence in front of me. The truth was laid bare, and there was no turning back. Melanie had betrayed me in the most profound way possible, and now I had to decide what I was going to do about it. Confronting Melanie was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. The weight of the evidence in that manila envelope felt like 100 pounds, dragging me down with every step I took toward the inevitable conversation. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, and a deep, gnawing sadness that threatened to consume me. But beneath it all, there was a cold resolve. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to let her dodge the truth any longer. I waited until she came home one evening, her face weary from whatever lie she had been living that day. She walked through the door with the same detached expression she'd worn for weeks, dropping her purse on the table without a second glance at me. But this time, I wasn't going to let her retreat into her excuses and vague explanations. "Melanie," I called out, my voice steady, but my heart pounding in my chest. She looked up, startled by the intensity in my tone. I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, like a deer caught in headlights, as if she already knew what was coming. "We need to talk," I said, motioning for her to sit down. She hesitated, then slowly moved to the couch, her movements stiff and uneasy. I could feel the tension in the room thickening, a palpable force pressing down on both of us. I sat across from her, the envelope clutched in my hand. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it, to spill out the ugly truth that I had spent the past few days grappling with. But I knew I had to. There was no turning back now. "I know what you've been doing," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but each word laced with the gravity of the situation. I placed the envelope on the coffee table between us, sliding it toward her. "I have the proof." Melanie's eyes widened, her face draining of color. She didn't move, didn't reach for the envelope. Instead, she just stared at it, as if it were a bomb that might go off if she touched it. The silence in the room was deafening, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "What proof?" "Everything," I said, my tone hardening. "Photos, bank statements, records of every lie you've told me. I know about Richard. I know about the money. I know everything." Her reaction was almost imperceptible, a slight shiver that ran through her body. a tightening of her grip on the edge of the couch. She looked away, unable to meet my gaze, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it, to twist the truth into something less damning. But then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she looked back at me, her eyes filling with tears.
"I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking.
"I never meant for it to go this far."
"Then why?" I demanded, my voice rising as the anger I'd been holding back surged to the surface.
"Why, Melanie? Why did you do it?"
She closed her eyes, the tears spilling over her cheeks. "It wasn't about love," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was never about that. Richard, he offered me security, a way out of the life I was afraid of. I did it for the money, for the future I thought I needed."
Her words hit me like a punch to the gut.
She wasn't even trying to sugarcoat it. She admitted it openly, almost coldly.
It was about money, plain and simple.
She had sold out everything we had for a few extra zeros in her bank account. For the promise of a safer, more comfortable life.
Did you ever think about what that would do to me? To us?
I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of fury and despair.
Did you ever consider what would happen if I found out?
She nodded, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her guilt.
I thought about it every day, she said, her voice barely audible. But I was scared that if I didn't take his offer, I'd be left with nothing.
I didn't know how to stop it once it started.
I stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I had married. The Melanie I knew would never have done something like this, would never have betrayed me in such a calculated, heartless way. But here she was, confessing it all without a shred of doubt.
"I'm so sorry," she repeated, reaching out as if to touch my hand, but I recoiled, unable to bear her touch. "I thought I was doing what was best for us, for me, for the future.
I never wanted to hurt you."
Her words hung in the air, empty and hollow.
No justification could make this right, no explanation that could erase the pain she had caused. I felt a cold numbness settle over me, the first shock of betrayal giving way to something darker, something I didn't want to name.
Melanie had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. There was no going back to the way things were.
The truth had been laid bare, and with it, any hope I had of salvaging what we once had was gone.
As Melanie's confession hung in the air,
a wave of emotions surged through me: rage, sorrow, disbelief. But amidst the chaos of my feelings, a strange clarity emerged, sharp and focused.
I realized that losing control and exploding in anger would only give her power over me. She had already taken so much, I couldn't let her take my dignity as well.
Instead of letting my emotions rule me, I made a conscious decision to keep my cool.
If Melanie thought she could get away with what she'd done, she was sorely mistaken. She would pay.
And she would pay dearly.
The more I thought about it, the more I realized that an outburst of anger would accomplish nothing. She'd already confessed, and what was done, was done.
But as I looked at her sitting across from me, eyes filled with tears and guilt, something inside me hardened. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about betrayal on a level one never could have imagined. She had traded our life, our future, for financial security and the promise of an easier life.
It wasn't just my heart she had broken. It was everything we had built together. I wasn't just angry, I was determined to make her pay for every single thing she had done. But I knew that I couldn't act rashly. This had to be precise and calculated.
If I was going to bring Melanie to her knees, I needed to think clearly, to plan every step with meticulous detail.
So I swallowed my anger, forced myself to stay calm, and began to devise a plan to take back everything she had betrayed me for and leave her with nothing. The first thing I did was study the evidence that Jack, the private detective, had gathered. I pored over every document, every transaction, every detail of her relationship with Richard. I needed to understand exactly what she had done, how much she had received, and what strings were attached to those payments. It was sickening to see it all laid out in black and white: the amounts, the dates, the calculated precision with which she had betrayed me. But instead of letting the rage take over, I used it to fuel my determination. I began by consulting with a financial advisor, someone I trusted implicitly. I explained the situation in broad strokes, omitting the more sordid details, and asked for guidance on how to protect my assets. Together, we reviewed every joint account, every investment, and every financial tie that bound me to Melanie. Slowly, methodically, we started to unravel those ties. I transferred funds into separate accounts, liquidated joint investments, and made sure that any financial advantage Melanie thought she had was gone. Next, I turned my attention to Richard. He was the linchpin in all of this, the one who had given Melanie the means to betray me. I needed to understand his vulnerabilities, to know where he was weakest. I hired another investigator, this time to dig into Richard's life, his business dealings, his relationships, and any skeletons in his closet that could be used against him. If he thought he could simply buy my wife's loyalty and walk away unscathed, he was in for a rude awakening. As I gathered more information, the pieces of my plan began to fall into place. I knew that I couldn't confront Melanie directly, not yet. I needed her to think that everything was normal, that I was still reeling from the shock of her confession, too broken to do anything but accept the reality she had thrust upon me. So I kept my distance, gave her space, and let her believe that she had won. Meanwhile, I worked behind the scenes, laying the groundwork for her downfall. I also started to prepare for the legal battle that was sure to come. I met with a divorce attorney, one of the best in the state, and laid out everything. Together, we strategized how to ensure that Melanie walked away with as little as possible. We discussed prenuptial agreements, hidden assets, and the possibility of proving her infidelity in court. Every angle was covered, every contingency planned for. But it wasn't just about the money or the assets. It was about making sure she understood the gravity of her betrayal, about stripping away the life she had sold me out for. I wanted her to feel the same sense of loss, the same despair that I had felt when I discovered the truth. I wanted to take away everything she had gained from her treachery and leave her with nothing but regret. I spent weeks meticulously planning every detail, refining my strategy, and ensuring that there were no loose ends. Every night, as Melanie slept soundly beside me, unaware of the storm that was brewing, I lay awake, thinking through each step, each move that would bring her closer to her inevitable downfall. When I was finally ready, I knew that the time for action was near. Melanie had made her choice, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. She had betrayed me for money, for security, for a future she thought she could buy. But she was about to learn that everything she had taken from me could be taken from her just as easily. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. And I was going to make sure that Melanie got exactly what she deserved. The next phase of my plan required a level of cunning and precision that went beyond mere strategy. It required deception. If I was going to take back what Melanie had stolen from me, I needed to hit her where it hurt the most, her newfound wealth. The money she had received from Richard was the very thing that had driven her to betray me, and now it was time to make sure that money was no longer hers to enjoy. To do that, I needed to play dirty, to use the same kind of underhanded tactics that had brought me to this point. I needed to forge documents that would transfer the funds she had so eagerly accepted from Richard into my possession. I began by researching everything I could about financial fraud, specifically how to manipulate and forge financial documents without leaving a trace. It was a dark, dangerous path to go down, but I was determined. I spent hours in front of my computer, reading about the techniques used by professional forgers, the tools they employed, and the legal loopholes they exploited. It was a world I had never imagined entering, but now, it was my only way forward. After arming myself with the necessary knowledge, I reached out to a contact I had met years ago during a business deal, a man with a reputation for being able to fix problems that required a certain level of discretion. His name was Victor, a shadowy figure who operated in the gray areas of the law. We had never been close, but I knew that if anyone could help me pull this off, it would be him. I met Victor in a small, dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, a place where people went when they didn't want to be seen. As I walked in,
The smell of stale beer and cigarettes hung in the air, and the low hum of conversation filled the room. Victor was sitting in a corner booth, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd as if assessing each person who walked through the door. "Good to see you, man," Victor said as I approached, a sly smile playing on his lips. He was a tall, wiry man with a face that seemed to be all angles and shadows. His hair was slicked back, and he wore a dark suit that was a little too polished for a place like this. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, there was no turning back now. "Victor," I said, keeping my voice low, "I need your help." He leaned back, studying me for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "This must be serious if you're coming to me," he replied. "What's the job?" I took a deep breath and explained the situation, leaving out the more personal details. I told him about the money, the betrayal, the need to make it all disappear into my accounts. Victor listened intently, nodding as I spoke, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You understand what you're asking, right? This isn't some small-time con. You're talking about forging documents that could land you in serious trouble if you get caught." "I know," I replied, my voice steady. "But I don't have a choice. She took everything from me, and I'm not going to let her get away with it." Victor studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," he said, "but it's going to cost you. And you're going to have to be patient. This kind of work takes time to get right." I agreed to his terms, knowing that whatever the cost, it would be worth it to see Melanie lose everything she had betrayed me for. Over the next few weeks, Victor and I worked closely together. He showed me how to create the documents I needed: bank statements, wire transfer forms, legal contracts, all meticulously forged to look as legitimate as possible. He taught me how to alter digital records and how to manipulate the financial systems to ensure that when the time came, the money would flow exactly where I wanted it to go. It was a painstaking process, one that required absolute precision and a steady hand. Each document had to be perfect, indistinguishable from the real thing. We spent hours hunched over computers and stacks of paper, going over every detail, every line of text, every number, until it was flawless. There could be no mistakes. No traces left behind that could link the forgery back to me. As we worked, I found myself sinking deeper into a mindset I had never thought possible. I became obsessed with the plan, with the need to make sure everything went off without a hitch. I thought of nothing else, my mind constantly racing with the next step, the next move that would bring me closer to my goal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the documents were ready. Victor assured me that everything was in place and that when I gave the signal, the money would be transferred out of Melanie's accounts and into mine. It was a dangerous game, one that could easily backfire, but I was prepared to take that risk. With the forged documents in hand, I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. Melanie had betrayed me for money, and now that money would be mine. I was ready to put the final part of my plan into action, to watch as everything she had sold her soul for was stripped away. The night was meticulously planned, every detail carefully orchestrated to ensure that it would be an evening Melanie would never forget. I had invited her to dinner, presenting it as an opportunity to clear the air, to discuss the future calmly and civilly. Little did she know, it was a trap, one that would ensnare her in the web of her lies and betrayals. I chose her favorite restaurant, a high-end place downtown that was perfect for the kind of intimate, yet formal, setting I needed. The dim lighting, the soft music, the impeccable service, it all added to the atmosphere of what she likely thought would be a reconciliatory evening. I arrived early, making sure everything was perfect, from the seating arrangement to the wine selection. I wanted her to be as comfortable as possible before I pulled the rug out from under her. When Melanie arrived, she looked as stunning as ever, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her curves, her makeup flawless. She smiled at me, a tentative, hopeful expression on her face as if she believed this might be the beginning of our healing.
I forced a smile in return, keeping my emotions tightly in check. Tonight wasn't about reconciliation. It was about retribution. We made small talk at first, discussing mundane topics: work, the weather, the latest movies. She seemed to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing as the evening progressed.
We ordered our meals, and I watched as she sipped her wine, completely unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon her.
Once the main course was served, I decided it was time.
I set down my fork and leaned back in my chair, fixing her with a gaze that I knew was anything but friendly. Melanie noticed the shift in my demeanor, her eyes narrowing slightly as if sensing that something was off.
Melanie, I began, my voice calm, almost casual. There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about. She looked at me, a slight frown creasing her forehead.
What is it?
She asked, her tone cautious.
I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope that contained the forged documents.
I placed it on the table between us, watching as her eyes flicked to it, then back to me.
Confusion and a hint of fear in her expression. You've been lying to me for a long time, I said, my voice steady. And I know everything.
Her face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks as the realization hit her. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her.
Don't, I said sharply.
Just listen. I took a deep breath, then began to recount everything: the affair with Richard, the money, the betrayal. I laid it all out, piece by piece, my words cutting through the air like a knife. With each revelation, I saw her shrink a little more in her seat, her eyes widening in horror and disbelief. And then, I said, my voice low and menacing, there's this. I slid the envelope across the table toward her. Melanie stared at it for a moment, her hands trembling as she reached out to take it. She opened it slowly, her fingers shaking as she pulled out the documents.
As she read through them, I saw the blood drain from her face completely, leaving her as white as a ghost. These documents, I continued, show that the money Richard gave you is no longer yours. It's been transferred into my accounts.
Every last cent.
You thought you could betray me and get away with it, but now you have nothing.
Melanie looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock, tears beginning to well up.
What? What have you done?
She whispered, her voice trembling.
What I had to do, I replied coldly.
You sold me out for money, Melanie. And now that money is gone. You're left with nothing.
Dot.
She shook her head, tears spilling over her cheeks. No. This can't be happening, she murmured, more to herself than to me. You can't do this.
I already have, I said, my voice hard. You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences. As the weight of my words settled on her, Melanie broke down completely. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking with the force of her despair. The elegant, composed woman who had walked into the restaurant that evening was gone. Replaced by a broken, shattered shell of the person I had once known. Please, she begged through her tears, please, we can fix this. I was wrong, I know that now. I'll do anything to make it right, just please don't leave me like this. Her desperation was palpable, but it did nothing to soften my resolve. I had already made up my mind, and no amount of pleading or apologies would change that. The trust between us was irreparably shattered, and there was no going back. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. And you're not getting a dime from me. You've already taken more than you deserve. Melanie looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with panic. No, please, don't do this, she cried. I'll change, I'll be better, just give me another chance. But I was done listening. I stood up, dropping a few bills on the table to cover the meal, and looked down at her one last time. Goodbye, Melanie, I said, my voice final. With that, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her behind in a crumpled heap of despair. I didn't look back. I didn't need to.
I knew that this chapter of my life was over, and there was no reason to revisit it.
As I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of betrayal that had been pressing down on me for so long was finally lifted.
Melanie had made her choice, and now she was paying the price. And as I walked away from the restaurant, the only thing I felt was a cold,
satisfied sense of justice.
Confronting Richard was the next logical step.
After all, he was the catalyst for everything that had transpired. Melanie's betrayal had been driven by greed, but Richard was the one who had enticed her and offered her the fortune that led her to abandon me. I knew he was a powerful man, a successful businessman who was used to getting what he wanted. But I also knew that he had underestimated me, assuming that I was just a casualty in his little game.
It was time to show him just how wrong he was.
I arranged the meeting under the guise of a business discussion, a neutral ground that would allow us to talk without raising suspicion. We met at a sleek, modern office building in the heart of the city, a place where deals were made and fortunes were won or lost. Richard's office was on the top floor, a testament to his status and wealth. The view from the windows was breathtaking, the city sprawled out below like a glittering sea of lights.
But I wasn't here to admire the scenery. Richard greeted me with a confident smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. He was a tall, imposing man with a sharp, calculating gaze, the kind of person who exuded power and control.
He extended a hand to me, which I shook with a firm grip, meeting his gaze without flinching.
"Good to see you," Richard said smoothly, motioning for me to sit. "I was surprised when you reached out."
"What can I do for you?"
I sat down, taking a moment to collect my thoughts. This wasn't going to be a friendly chat. And I wanted to make sure he understood that from the start. "I'm not here for pleasantries, Richard," I said, my tone serious. "I'm here to talk about the money and the consequences of any actions you might be considering." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued.
"The money?"
he repeated, leaning back in his chair.
"What about it?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I replied, my voice cold.
"The money you gave Melanie."
"It's no longer hers, and it's certainly not yours."
"It's mine now."
For
a moment, Richard's expression remained unreadable, but I could see the gears turning in his mind, calculating the situation. "Interesting," he said finally, his voice calm.
"But do you think I'm going to just let that slide?"
I leaned forward, locking eyes with him.
"You don't have a choice," I said evenly. "You've already lost. The money is gone, and there's nothing you can do to get it back." "But that's not why I'm here."
"I'm here to make sure you understand what will happen if you try." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of anger crossing his features.
"Are you threatening me?"
he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm warning you," I corrected him, my voice steady.
"If you so much as think about coming after me, there will be consequences you won't like."
"I know what kind of man you are, Richard. You're used to getting what you want, no matter who you have to crush to get it."
"But this time, you've met your match."
Richard's lips curled into a slight smirk. But there was no humor in it.
"You think you can scare me?"
he asked, leaning forward. "You have no idea who you're dealing with."
"I know exactly who I'm dealing with," I shot back.
"But I think you're the one who's underestimating me."
"You see, I'm not afraid to play dirty, just like you."
"And I have nothing left to lose. You took everything from me when you dragged Melanie into this,
and now, I'm taking everything from you.
So consider this your only warning, stay out of my way, or you'll regret it."
For a moment, we sat in silence, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard studied me as if trying to gauge just how serious I was.
Finally, he leaned back in his chair, the smirk fading from his face.
"You're bold, I'll give you that," he said quietly.
"But this isn't over. You've made an enemy, and you'd do well to remember that." I stood up, meeting his gaze one last time. "The only enemy I've made is the one sitting in front of me," I replied. "And if you come after me, I won't hesitate to destroy you." With that, I turned and walked out of the office, leaving Richard behind to stew in his thoughts.
I knew that he wouldn't take my warning lightly, but I also knew that I had the upper hand.
The money was mine, and Melanie was out of the picture.
Richard might have been a powerful man, but even the powerful have weaknesses.
And I was more than willing to exploit his if it meant protecting what was now mine. As I stepped out of the building and into the cool night air, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction.
Richard had thought he could control everything, that he could manipulate people like pieces on a chessboard. But he had underestimated me, and now he knew that I wasn't someone to be trifled with.
The game was far from over, but for now, I had won this round. And I was ready for whatever came next. The aftermath of our confrontation was not something I witnessed firsthand, but I heard enough to know that Melanie's life quickly spiraled into chaos.
The money she had so greedily accepted from Richard was gone, and with it, the security she had betrayed me for. She tried, desperately, to salvage what little remained of her once comfortable life. But it was all in vain. Melanie's first instinct, of course, was to go after Richard. She thought that he might still have some obligation to her, that he might feel some residual affection or guilt that could be leveraged into financial support. But she quickly learned just how little she truly meant to him. Richard was a businessman to his core, cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Once he realized that the money was gone and that Melanie was no longer of any use to him, he discarded her without a second thought. Any doors she might have once had access to were slammed shut in her face. Desperate, she turned to her friends, those fair-weather companions who had once fawned over her and admired her newfound wealth. But Melanie had made a critical mistake in thinking that money could buy loyalty. The moment they realized she was broke, they vanished, leaving her to fend for herself. She was no longer the glamorous, enviable figure she had once been. Instead, she was a cautionary tale, someone who had flown too close to the sun and crashed spectacularly to the ground. With nowhere else to turn, Melanie began liquidating what little assets she still owned. The luxury car, the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, all of it was sold off in a frantic attempt to raise enough money to keep herself afloat. But it wasn't enough. The debts she had accumulated in her pursuit of the high life were overwhelming, far beyond what she could ever hope to repay. Creditors began hounding her, the polite phone calls and letters quickly escalating to threats of legal action. Melanie was drowning, and there was no one left to save her. The life she had traded her soul for was crumbling around her, piece by piece, until all that remained was a hollow shell of what once was. She had betrayed the one person who might have stood by her. And in the end, she was left utterly alone, with nothing but regret to keep her company. As for me, I watched it all unfold from a distance, content to let her suffer the consequences of her choices. I did not attempt to contact her, no effort to intervene as her life collapsed around her. Why would I? Melanie had chosen her path, and now she was walking it alone. Every report I received, every whispered rumor about her latest misfortune, brought me a deep, cold satisfaction. This was what justice looked like, raw, unflinching, and merciless. I could have stopped it, I suppose. I could have stepped in and offered her a lifeline, even if only out of pity. But the truth was, I had no pity left for Melanie. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it. And I? I was free. Free from the lies, the deceit, the betrayal. Free from the woman who had so carelessly thrown away everything we had built together. My revenge was not just for the financial ruin I had orchestrated. It was in the knowledge that she had nothing left. That everything she had betrayed me for was gone, leaving her destitute and alone. I savored that knowledge and relished the way it filled me with a sense of closure, of justice. Melanie had taken everything from me, but I had taken it all back, and then some. She was the one left with nothing, and I was the one who had triumphed in the end. And so, I moved on with my life, the memory of Melanie's downfall a distant, almost forgotten chapter. I found peace in the simple pleasures of life. In the knowledge that I had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side.
Melanie, wherever she was no longer my concern. She was a ghost, a reminder of a life I had left behind.
And as I looked to the future, I knew one thing for certain. Revenge had never tasted so sweet.